The night before the 1973 Academy Awards, I sat at my typewriter and wrote an 8-page speech. I was going to win Best Actor for The Godfather. Everybody knew it, including me. And I was not going to be there. I called a 26-year-old activist named Sasheen Littlefeather and asked her to go in my place. She didn't have an evening dress. I told her to wear her buckskin. She arrived at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion minutes before they called my name. When Roger Moore offered her the Oscar, she raised her hand and refused it. Half the audience booed. John Wayne tried to rush the stage and had to be physically restrained by security. Backstage, people shouted war cries at her. A producer threatened to have her arrested if she stayed at that podium more than 60 seconds. I watched all of it on television from my living room alone. They called me the most difficult man in Hollywood. They said I was impossible, ungovernable, a catastrophe with a paycheck. My name is Marlon Brando, and I always thought that was a strange way to describe someone who simply refused to pretend. Let me tell you what they meant when they called me difficult, because they used the word for 50 years, and after 50 years it starts to sound like a fact, and I prefer to deal in facts. They didn't mean I was violent. I wasn't. They didn't mean I was unreliable. I showed up, I worked, I delivered. What they meant was something simpler and more personal than any of that. I would not do what I was told. Not out of ego, not because I believed my own reputation, but because I had a theory, a single idea about what made acting real. And that theory required me to behave in ways that made every director, every producer, every studio executive I ever worked with want to pull their own teeth out. The theory was simple. Truth on screen looks like truth in life, and truth in life cannot be scheduled. Hollywood wanted scheduled. Hollywood wanted the same thing in take 15 that it got in take 1. Hollywood wanted stars who remembered their lines, arrived on time, and didn't put their hands near anybody's ice bucket. I was none of those things for 50 consecutive years. And for 50 consecutive years, the phone kept ringing. This is the story of why. I arrived in New York in 1943, with holes in my socks and holes in my mind. That's how I put it later. It was accurate. What I found in New York was Stella Adler. She had studied with Stanislavski himself, traveled to Paris in 1934, spent weeks with the man, came back and told Lee Strasberg he had been teaching everything wrong. Strasberg never forgave her. The split between them defined American acting for 40 years. I landed in the middle of it without understanding any of that, and Stella changed everything I thought I knew about what I was supposed to be doing. What Stella taught me was not about pain. That's the misunderstanding people carry about the method, that it's about bleeding into your character, about excavating your own suffering and spreading it on the role. Stella taught imagination. She told me, your talent is in your imagination. The day you stop using your imagination, your talent will die. I wrote that down. I kept it. The imagination part led directly to the cue cards. Because here is what I understood about memorizing lines. The moment you know exactly what comes next, you stop searching. And the search, that half second of genuine uncertainty when you reach for a word and find it, is the only thing on camera that looks like a real person thinking. Recite a perfectly memorized line, and the audience feels the memorization. Reach for it. Actually reach the way people reach for words in real life, and they feel the thought. So I didn't memorize. I had cue cards placed wherever the camera couldn't find them. On The Godfather, they were behind a lamp in the Don's study. They were taped to a wall in the garden. In the consigliere scenes, Robert Duvall held them just off frame, and I read over his shoulder. During the garden sequence with Al Pacino, a scene that acting teachers still use in classrooms 50 years later, Duvall watched me read my lines off the bark of a tree that stood just above Pacino's head. I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse. Read from a card. Look how they massacred my boy. Read from a card.
Paramount hadn't wanted to cast me. I was box office poison by 1971, a decade of expensive films that didn't make money, a reputation for making productions miserable. Francis Ford Coppola threatened to walk off the project if they didn't let him try. The studio agreed to an audition. I went to Francis's apartment. I stuffed my cheeks with cotton. I put shoe polish in my hair. I spoke very quietly, and Francis filmed the whole thing on a home camera and sent the tape to the Paramount executive Robert Evans. Evans called Francis the next morning. "Who is that old Italian man, and where did you find him?" I was 47 years old. I had been the most recognizable actor in America for 2 decades. Evans had no idea it was me. That was the audition. That was the performance. And it was built on the exact same principle as the cue cards. Show up, find it fresh, let the camera catch whatever happens. Paramount approved the casting. They didn't have a real choice. The fart machine. I have to tell you about the fart machine. I owned a remote-controlled fart machine, and I used it on film sets throughout the 1970s. I include this not for comedy, but for accuracy. Any portrait of me that leaves out the fart machine is leaving out something essential. I believed then, and believe now, that the element of surprise produces authentic human reaction, and authentic human reaction is the only thing worth capturing on camera. Crew members who found themselves on the receiving end of the fart machine did not always share this philosophy. I respected their disagreement. I also believed in the practical joke as a form of affection. Jack Nicholson lived up the road from me on Mulholland Drive. The press called that stretch Bad Boy Drive, which I always thought was a bit generous to everybody involved. Jack and I were genuinely close, in the way that two people who understand each other's particular species of stubbornness can be close. One April Fool's Day, I called him and told him I was selling my house to someone he despised. I made the story detailed. I let it develop over the course of a conversation. I let him get fully, genuinely furious. Then I told him it was a joke. Jack said later, Marlon never stopped laughing about the time he got me to go completely crazy. He was right. I didn't stop. I still think about it with tremendous satisfaction.
When a reporter from the New York Times requested an interview, I had my assistant direct the facts to my dog. The dog's name was Dr. Tim, an English Mastiff, my favorite companion for the last years of my life. Dr. Tim replied to the facts within 30 minutes. Marlon Brando is unavailable. Dr. Tim signed the reply himself. The reporter published their piece anyway, without the interview. I thought that showed initiative. What I was, underneath all of it, was a man who found the performance of normalcy considerably more exhausting than anything I ever did on screen. Hollywood wanted a version of me that could be scheduled and managed, a Marlon Brando who arrived when expected, said what was written, and went home without incident. I looked for that version of myself for a long time. I never found him. Francis Ford Coppola called me about Apocalypse Now in 1976. I said yes before he finished the pitch. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was not reading the script, or the novel the film was based on, or anything related to the production in the months between saying yes and arriving in the Philippines. My third mistake was gaining weight instead of losing it, having promised Francis I would do the opposite. He discovered all 3 of these facts simultaneously when I stepped off the plane in Manila. I could tell he was having a complicated reaction. Francis is a man who expresses complicated reactions with his entire body. Production stopped. 900 people, the full cast, the full crew, the cameras, the equipment, sat idle while Francis came to my trailer and read me the script out loud from the first page so I could understand what I had agreed to do. The production was already in disaster. A typhoon had destroyed the sets earlier in the year. Martin Sheen had suffered a near-fatal heart attack on location. The budget was eating itself. Francis had not slept properly in months. He sat in my air-conditioned trailer in the Philippine heat and read me a script I should have read 6 months earlier. What came out of those conversations, the conversations Francis filmed because his wife Eleanor was documenting everything,
was Kurtz. Not the Kurtz in the script, the Kurtz I found in that trailer, talking with Francis about what a man becomes when all the rules he was given turn out not to apply. I improvised for hours. Some of it is in the finished film. Some is in Eleanor's documentary. Some has never been shown publicly. In the jungle, cue cards were impossible, so Coppola fed me my lines through an electronic earpiece, his assistant reading the script into my ear in real time. According to Robert Duvall, what came out of my mouth was almost never what went in through the earpiece. I would receive a written line and deliver something adjacent, something the script had pointed toward but hadn't reached. Duvall couldn't account for why it worked. Neither could I entirely. It was finding. The same finding as the cue cards, just faster, in a darker place. I also brought a copy of T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men to the set. It wasn't in the original script. I showed it to Francis and said, "This is Kurtz. This is what he reads in the dark." Francis looked at it for a moment and said, "Read it." I read it. It stayed in the film. The movie was 3.5 hours long when it came out. The cut I watched at the premiere was not the cut I had agreed to. I called Francis afterward. That conversation was shorter than the one we had in the trailer.
The director of Mutiny on the Bounty in 1962 was Louis Milestone. By the end of production, Milestone told the Saturday Evening Post the film should have been called The Mutiny of Marlon Brando. The producer, Aaron Rosenberg, described those months as 6 weeks of hell, though we were there considerably longer than 6 weeks, which tells you something about how it felt. I was the first actor in Hollywood history paid $1 million for a single film. That was Mutiny on the Bounty. I earned every cent of it, though not in ways the studio had intended. What I cost productions was not just money, though I cost that too. What I cost was certainty. The certainty that the day would unfold the way it had been planned. I disrupted sequences. I insisted on retakes when scenes hadn't found their truth. I changed lines on the day of shooting because the written version was wrong, and I could feel that it was wrong. Most directors had a finite amount of energy for arguing with me about this, and when that energy ran out, they filmed what I did. On The Godfather, before the scene where 2 crew members carry an ailing Don Corleone up the mansion stairs, 2 men who had volunteered to be on camera, who wanted to be in the film, I filled the stretcher with weights while they weren't looking. I watched them struggle up the stairs under the load and said nothing. The scene is in the finished film. You can see on their faces exactly how much it cost them. On the Missouri breaks, during a scene meant to be quietly menacing, I fed a carrot to a horse from my own mouth, then turned to a nearby donkey and said, "I don't love you, you harlot. I'm not even speaking to you." Then I played a harmonica with my back to the horse, because my character loved her so much he couldn't look her in the eye. The horse urinated during the performance. I said, "Well, that's a fine thing." Director Arthur Penn kept the camera running. The scene is in the finished film. They kept hiring me. That is the fact that matters. Milestone called it The Mutiny of Marlon Brando, and the studio hired me again. Francis Ford Coppola, who sat in my trailer reading me a script I should have already read, hired me again after that. The phone kept ringing, and I kept picking it up, because the only reason I was in Hollywood at all, I said this openly more than once, was that I didn't have the moral courage to refuse the money. I had been aware of the treatment of Native Americans for years. What I hadn't been was specific. Specific about which treaties, which dates, which documented sequence of promises made and broken. That changed when I started spending time with the people who had been living inside that history their whole lives. In February 1973, 200 members of the American Indian Movement occupied Wounded Knee, a town on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, and faced off against thousands of federal marshals. It was ongoing when the Academy Awards were held in March. I had been thinking for months about what it would mean to sit in that theater in a tuxedo and accept a prize from an industry that had spent 50 years casting white actors as Native Americans in films that made fortunes from the caricature. I wrote 8 pages,
I typed them myself the night before the ceremony. The speech cited specific films, specific stereotypes, specific violations. It was detailed because the situation was detailed, and I had spent enough of my life watching serious things be treated as decoration. Sacheen Littlefeather had been working in activist circles in San Francisco when we met. She was 26 years old. When I called her the night before the ceremony, I told her I needed someone to go in my place and read the speech. She asked what she should wear. I told her to wear her buckskin, her traditional dress. She arrived at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion minutes before they called my name. A producer told her backstage that if she used more than 60 seconds at the podium, she would be arrested. She went up anyway. Half the audience applauded, half booed. John Wayne moved from the wings toward the stage and had to be physically stopped by security guards. Backstage, people shouted war cries at her. In the years that followed, she said she was blacklisted. She said the federal government had encouraged the industry not to hire her. She spent the rest of her life outside of Hollywood, working in hospice care and in native health advocacy. I was in my living room watching on television. I knew exactly what I was asking her to do when I called. I asked anyway, because the 8 pages were true, and someone had to say them in that room in front of those cameras. And the person who said them would pay a price I was not prepared to pay myself. That is the honest version of that night. I include it because I have had 50 years of being called brave for what Sacheen Littlefeather actually did.
In 1996, I agreed to appear in The Island of Dr. Moreau, filmed in Queensland, Australia. My daughter Cheyenne had died by suicide the year before. I want to say that plainly before I tell the rest of this, because the rest of this will sound like chaos, and some of it was, but not all chaos has the same origin. I arrived on set and told the first person I saw, "Go home, this is not a good film to work on, it's cursed." That person was actor David Thewlis, who had just flown in from England. He stayed. In retrospect, that was his mistake. I refused to read the script. My assistant read my lines to me through a hidden earpiece. During one scene, I accidentally picked up the local police radio frequency and began repeating emergency dispatch calls into the shot. Production continued. I suggested to director John Frankenheimer that we pause production for several months, rewrite the script, and reveal in the third act that Dr. Moreau was, in fact, a dolphin. Frankenheimer declined. I thought he was being rigid about it. What I did instead was discover Nelson de la Rosa. Nelson was Dominican, the world's smallest man, roughly 2 feet and 4 inches tall, cast as a background creature in the film. When I first saw him on set, I reportedly said, "You're telling me there's a man in there?" I became immediately, completely fascinated. I had the script rewritten to give him more scenes. I had him dressed in the same white linen costume I was wearing. I played the piano in one scene while Nelson played a miniature piano on top of the piano. Mike Myers later said this dynamic inspired the character of Mini-Me in the Austin Powers films. There is a scene in the finished film where I sit consoling my character's daughter. I am wearing a champagne ice bucket on my head, like a hat. No explanation is given. I found the ice bucket on the set, picked it up, put it on my head, and declined to remove it when filming began. Frankenheimer had run out of the kind of energy required to argue with me about an ice bucket. The scene was filmed. It went into the final cut. The Island of Dr. Moreau received a Razzie Award for Worst Supporting Actor. For me. I did not attend the ceremony. In 1958, I decided to direct a film. This was my first mistake of that particular year, though not my last. The property was a novel called The Authentic Death of Henry Jones, a Western, a revenge story, a man betrayed by his partner and spending years tracking him down. I had been wanting to make a Western for years. I bought the rights through my own production company, Pennebaker Productions, hired Stanley Kubrick to direct, and sat down with him to discuss the script. Kubrick and I did not agree on much. What I remember most clearly is the meeting where I placed a stopwatch on the table and told him he had a fixed amount of time to raise his objections to the material before the buzzer rang. Kubrick looked at the stopwatch. He looked at me. He worked through his list of grievances until the timer ran out, at which point I told him we were done for the day. He left the project shortly afterward. Whether he resigned or I fired him depends on who is telling the story. Kubrick said it ended amicably. He was paid his full director's fee without directing a single scene. I will let you form your own view of what amicably means. I then fired Sam Peckinpah, who had written the original screenplay. Then I fired his replacement, Calder Willingham. Then I volunteered to direct the film myself, which is the decision that produced everything that came after. Paramount expected the shoot to take 3 months. It took 6. The budget was $2 million. I spent $6 million. I shot 1 million feet of film, a number that sounds impossible until you understand that I would halt production for hours, sometimes days, waiting for the waves on the nearby ocean to look exactly right. The crew sat on the beach at $50,000 a day while I watched the Pacific Ocean and waited for it to cooperate. It did not always cooperate on schedule. I waited anyway. I offered cash rewards, out of my own pocket, up to $300, to extras who produced the most authentic reactions in key scenes. I wanted them to actually feel something, not perform feeling something. The extras appreciated the money. The studio did not appreciate the method. When I finally delivered my cut, it ran 5 hours. The producer, Frank Rosenberg, sat across from me and said it was just an assemblage of footage. I looked at him for a moment. Then I got pretty sick of the whole project and handed it over to someone else to finish. Paramount cut it to 2 hours and 21 minutes, shot a new ending, and turned every character into a simple archetype of good and evil. I had built a film where everyone lied. Everyone except Carl Malden's character. That was the point. That was the moral architecture of the whole thing. Paramount made Malden a liar too, and called it a final cut. The film was released in 1961 to mixed reviews and poor box office. I never directed again. What I wrote about it later, in my autobiography, was this. By then, I was bored with the whole project and walked away from it. That sentence is true. It is also not the whole truth. The whole truth is that One-Eyed Jacks was the only time in my career I had complete creative control over something. The script, the casting, the camera, the edit, and the result was a film that cost 3 times its budget, ran 5 hours in my version, and was taken away from me before anyone could see what I had actually made. Martin Scorsese later called it his favorite Western. Steven Spielberg supervised its 4K restoration. The Criterion Collection put it in their library. That happened 60 years after I made it, and 30 years after Paramount told me it was just an assemblage of footage. I did not go back to directing, but I have thought many times about what was in those 5 hours that nobody ever saw. Near the end of my life, the Academy offered me a Lifetime Achievement Oscar. The condition was that I attend the ceremony in person to accept it. I declined. Not as protest, not to make a point. I simply didn't want to go sit in another theater and perform gratitude. I had spent 50 years performing things I didn't feel and refusing to perform things I did. And by that point, I had a clear sense of which performances were worth the effort. Lying for a living. That's what I called acting late in my life. I tried to make a series of instructional DVDs with that title. I invited Sean Penn, John Voight, Nick Nolte to the sessions. I wanted to show people how it actually worked. Not the mythology, not the method as religion, but the practical mechanics of finding a true thing in a false situation and holding on to it long enough to be filmed. The DVDs were never released. We ran into trouble, as we generally did. That seemed appropriate. What I know, after all of it, is this. The part of you that's still alive, still actually responding, still actually searching, not performing your own performance, that part has to survive the process of making a film. Most of what the industry does to actors is kill that part slowly. The schedules, the takes, the pressure to give them the same thing again and again. I refused to let it die.
That refusal looked, from the outside, like a man who was impossible to work with. From the inside, it felt like the only way to keep telling the truth.
They said I was difficult. They said it from the first day I walked into a rehearsal room and started doing things nobody had planned for. And they were still saying it 50 years later when I was putting an ice bucket on my head in a film about a dolphin scientist in Queensland. The word followed me the way a smell follows a coat. Here is what I know about that word. Difficult means you made people work harder than they planned to. It means you didn't take the shape the container wanted. It means something happened that wasn't on the schedule. The only reason I was ever in Hollywood was that I didn't have the moral courage to refuse the money. I said that for years and meant it, and people always laughed and then looked at me to see if I was joking. I wasn't joking, but I was there, and while I was there, I made something real happen on screen, in the way that only happens when someone refuses to cooperate with the parts of the process that make things false. You can still watch it. Whatever you feel when you do, that's not a performance. That's a person. My name is Marlon Brando, and I was the most difficult man in Hollywood. They kept calling me anyway. And here you are.